Judge rejects black woman's case. The judge sat silently, mocking the case as ridiculous and a waste of taxpayer money. But after a single search on the courthouse steps, that same judge was begging for mercy within an hour. The woman he had just humiliated had far more power than he could have imagined, and when her true identity was revealed in the crowded courtroom, the judge's world came crashing down in a way he never expected. This story will shock you and prove that justice always finds a way. The federal courthouse in the heart of Chicago rose like a monument to justice, its majestic limestone columns and granite stairs exuding an air of solemnity and authority. It was a cool Tuesday morning in October at 9:30 a.m., and the building buzzed with the familiar energy of lawyers, clerks, and citizens navigating the complex machinery of the American legal system. Dr. Amelia Richardson entered through the courthouse's heavy brass doors with the measured steps of someone who had been respected in board meetings and lecture halls for decades. At 55, she carried herself with a quiet dignity born of a lifetime of overcoming obstacles and exceeding expectations. Her simple black suit was tailored but not flashy, her graying hair neatly pulled back into a bun, and her leather bag showed the wear and tear of years of purposeful use. Despite his unassuming appearance, there was an undeniable strength to Dr. Richardson's presence. Perhaps it was the absolute confidence with which he moved through the crowded lobby, or the intensity of his dark eyes, which seemed to take in every detail around him. He had spent the past 18 months preparing for this day, gathering evidence, laying the groundwork for his case, and seeking justice for an injustice that had fundamentally altered his life. The case was significant on a personal level far beyond legal precedent or financial compensation. 3 years earlier, Dr. Richardson's younger brother, Marcus, had died while in police custody under circumstances the family believed warranted criminal charges. Despite compelling evidence of abuse, the prosecutor's office had refused to pursue charges, citing insufficient evidence and conflicting witness statements. The civil lawsuit he filed today represented his last hope for accountability and justice. Courtroom 7. B, with its dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and formal atmosphere designed to inspire both respect and awe, was a testament to the tradition of justice. The gallery was sparsely filled at this early hour, with only a few spectators, the court reporter, and legal observers present to witness the morning's proceedings. Dr. Richardson sat down at the plaintiff's table, methodically organizing his documents and legal summaries with the certainty of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. His attorney, James Mitchell, was a seasoned civil rights lawyer with a solid track record in police misconduct cases, but Dr. Richardson had insisted on maintaining significant control over the legal strategy and presentation of the case. As he reviewed his notes one last time, Dr. Richardson noticed a commotion near the judge's chambers. Loud voices could be heard through the thick wooden doors, though the words themselves were unclear. He glanced at his watch. 9:45 a.m. The hearing was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. Exactly at 10 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order, and Judge William Patterson emerged from his chambers with a theatrical display that suggested he enjoyed the ceremony and authority of his office. Judge Patterson was 62 years old, with silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and an authoritative presence that had served him well throughout his 25-year judicial career. However, those who knew him professionally understood that Judge Patterson's imposing appearance masked some troubling tendencies. He had gained a reputation for being dismissive of civil rights cases, particularly those involving police misconduct. His courtroom demeanor toward black attorneys and plaintiffs had been the subject of multiple bar complaints, though none had resulted in formal disciplinary action. "Rise," the clerk announced, and the court rose as Judge Patterson stepped behind his massive mahogany bench. "Sit down," said Judge Patterson, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His eyes scanned the courtroom, meeting the sparse attendance with mild disappointment. "Today we have before us the case of Richardson versus City of Chicago, case number 2023, CV 4856. Is the plaintiff ready to proceed?" James Mitchell stood up, adjusted his tie, and addressed the court. Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff is ready. Judge Patterson's gaze shifted to Dr. Richardson, and he caught something that immediately put him on edge. It was a look he had seen countless times before, a mix of suspicion, condescension, and barely concealed irritation. It was the look of someone who had already decided his case was worthless before hearing a single word of evidence. Your Honor, Dr. Richardson said as he rose from his desk, despite his attorney's gesture for him to remain seated. May I address the court? Judge Patterson's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. Ms. Richardson, you are represented by counsel. If you have something to say, you may say it through your attorney. Dr. Richardson, he corrected firmly, and I believe I have the right to address the court regarding the factual inaccuracies in the characterization of this case. The correction seemed to anger Judge Patterson further. What kind of doctor? He asked with barely concealed sarcasm. Constitutional law, Your Honor. I'm a professor at Northwestern University Law School. The explanation seemed to momentarily surprise Judge Patterson, but he quickly recovered. Well, Dr. Richardson, perhaps you should focus on teaching and leave the practice of law to the real practitioners. Judge Patterson's bias, which had been evident from the start, was now clear. Based on my review of the preliminary motions and the arguments presented here today, Judge Patterson continued, I am dismissing this case with prejudice under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 12b-6 for failure to state a claim capable of relief. The dismissal was legally indefensible. They had not even been allowed to present evidence or call witnesses. Judge Patterson was effectively ruling that no factual basis could support their claims, which was clearly wrong given the documented inconsistencies in the police reports. Your Honor, said Dr. Richardson, rising to his feet despite his lawyer's attempts to stop him, this is a complete miscarriage of justice. You denied us our procedural rights, you displayed open bias, and you used language in this case that revealed your bias. The morning air felt fresh and clean after the suffocating atmosphere of Judge Patterson's courtroom. Dr. Richardson stood on the courthouse steps, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. In 30 years of legal practice, he had never seen such blatant judicial misconduct. He took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a number he hadn't called in years. The name on the screen read, David Chen, Office of the Attorney General. David, this is Amelia Richardson. I need to speak with you immediately about a matter of judicial misconduct. Yes, I can be in Washington this afternoon. The federal courthouse in Chicago, Judge William Patterson. David, what I'm about to tell you will shock you. The conversation with David Chen lasted about 20 minutes, during which Dr. Richardson provided a detailed account of Judge Patterson's behavior, including his racist remarks and denial of procedural rights. As they spoke, she could hear the growing concern in David's voice. Amelia, are you saying he dismissed your case without allowing you to present evidence? David asked. Not only that, but he used language that clearly indicated racial bias and prejudice. David, I've been in courts for 30 years, and I've never seen anything this blatant. There was a long silence. Amelia, I want you to know that this call couldn't have come at a better time. We've been investigating complaints about Patterson for months, but we needed someone with your credibility to provide first-hand testimony. As he hung up the phone, James Mitchell looked at her with a mix of surprise and growing understanding. Amelia, who did you just call? Dr. Richardson smiled for the first time since he entered the courthouse that morning. David Chen, Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. We went to law school together and have stayed in touch over the years. My God, Mitchell whispered, Patterson has no idea what he's gotten himself into. No, he doesn't. You'll see, James. What Judge Patterson doesn't understand is that I haven't just been teaching constitutional law for the past 30 years. I've been advising the Department of Justice on judicial misconduct cases. I helped draft the current federal guidelines on judicial bias. That afternoon, at 3 p.m., Dr. Richardson found himself in a conference room at the Department of Justice headquarters in Washington, D.C., surrounded by federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and high-ranking officials from the Attorney General's office. The meeting had been arranged with extraordinary speed, reflecting both the seriousness of the allegations and Dr. Richardson's standing in the legal community. Over the next 2 hours, Dr. Richardson provided a detailed account of the morning's events, supported by copies of court transcripts, expedited by James Mitchell's court reporter, audio recordings, and witness statements. Federal officials listened with growing astonishment and concern as the pattern of bias became undeniable. By 6 p.m., news of the federal investigation into Judge Patterson had begun to leak to the media. Dr. Richardson's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters, legal commentators, and civil rights organizations seeking information about the judicial misconduct investigation. He had agreed to give a special interview on the judicial misconduct investigation in the case on CNN's Anderson Cooper 360 program. Sitting in the network's Washington bureau preparing for the live broadcast, he reflected on how quickly events had unfolded. Dr. Richardson, Anderson Cooper began as he went live. You are at the center of one of the most significant judicial misconduct cases in recent memory. Can you tell us what happened in that Chicago courtroom this morning? 3 weeks after the JFK incident, Dr. Richardson found himself in an even more imposing setting, a hearing room in the Rayburn House Office Building, where the House Judiciary Committee was conducting an emergency hearing on judicial misconduct and civil rights violations in the federal court system. The hearing had been triggered by preliminary findings from the DOJ investigation that not only revealed extensive evidence of Judge Patterson's bias, but also uncovered similar patterns among several other federal judges. The scope of the issue had shocked even seasoned civil rights researchers. Dr. Richardson, said Committee Chairman Congressman James Lewis, your experience in Judge Patterson's courtroom has opened a window onto a much larger problem. Can you explain to the committee what your research has uncovered? The congressional hearing continued for another 4 hours, with Dr. Richardson providing detailed testimony on judicial bias, constitutional violations, and the urgent need for reform regarding the issues he had identified. His academic credentials and expertise in judicial misconduct made his testimony particularly persuasive, and several committee members indicated their intention to introduce legislation addressing the issues he had highlighted. When the hearing concluded, Dr. Richardson was approached by dozens of civil rights attorneys, legal scholars, and advocates eager to share their own experiences with biased judges. The stories were strikingly consistent: disrespectful treatment, inappropriate comments, denial of procedural rights, and outcomes that seemed predetermined based on racial stereotypes. 6 months after the encounter in the courtroom, Judge William Patterson was no longer on the federal bench. When evidence of misconduct became public, the impeachment process moved swiftly, and he was removed from office by a bipartisan majority in the Senate. Based on the expanded investigation triggered by Dr. Richardson's case, 3 more federal judges had received disciplinary action or been removed from office. More importantly, Congress passed the Federal Judicial Accountability Act, which mandates bias training for all federal judges, establishes statistical monitoring systems for civil rights cases, and creates new mechanisms for investigating and addressing judicial misconduct. A year after the courtroom encounter that sparked this chain of events, Dr. Richardson delivered the opening address at the American Bar Association's annual conference, the most influential gathering of the American legal community, representing thousands of lawyers, judges, and legal scholars. A year ago, he began, I walked into a federal courtroom seeking justice for my brother's death. I did not know that what I would encounter there would spark a national conversation about bias in our judicial system. The speech continued for another 30 minutes as Dr. Richardson summarized the progress made while acknowledging the work that still needed to be done. The reforms triggered by his case had led to measurable improvements in civil rights case outcomes, but he emphasized that lasting change required sustained attention and commitment. Reflecting on the past year since his encounter with Judge Patterson, Dr. Richardson was amazed at how his moment of standing up for justice had created ripples that continued to spread throughout the legal system. The resulting changes were far more significant than he could have imagined when he made that phone call from the courthouse steps. But perhaps most importantly, the judicial misconduct investigation had uncovered new evidence in his brother Marcus's case. The police officers involved in his death had been charged with civil rights violations, and the city of Chicago had agreed to implement comprehensive police reforms. It wasn't the same as bringing Marcus back, but it was a form of justice that honored his memory and could prevent similar tragedies. 2 years after their first meeting, Dr. Richardson received a phone call that unexpectedly brought the story full circle. The caller was James Patterson, an attorney in Milwaukee and the adult son of Judge Patterson. "Dr. Richardson," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I know this call may be unwelcome, but I needed to reach out to you personally." Dr. Richardson was surprised by the call, but agreed to listen to what he had to say. "I want you to know, exposing my father's prejudice and abuse was the right thing to do. As his son, it was painful to watch his career end in disgrace, but as a lawyer who believes in justice, I am grateful that someone finally held him accountable." As Dr. Richardson entered his third year of leading judicial reform efforts, he found himself facing new challenges and opportunities. The success of federal reforms had inspired similar efforts at the state level, and he was now advising attorneys general across the country on how to implement bias monitoring and accountability measures in their own court systems. The work was challenging but extremely rewarding. Each month brought new evidence that the reforms were making a real difference in people's lives. Civil rights case approval rates had increased significantly in courts where bias training was implemented, and several judges had voluntarily recused themselves from cases where they recognized potential bias. The judicial reform movement sparked by Dr. Richardson had begun to attract international attention. Legal scholars and human rights advocates from around the world were studying American reforms as a model for addressing bias in their own judicial systems. He had been invited to speak at conferences in London, Geneva, and The Hague, sharing his research and recommendations with international audiences. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international legal standards were being re-examined in light of the bias research catalyzed by his experience. Perhaps the most significant validation of Dr. Richardson's work came when the Supreme Court cited his research in a landmark civil rights decision. In the case of Williams v. State of Alabama, the court relied on his statistical analysis of judicial bias to identify systematic discrimination in state courts that violated the Equal Protection Clause. Justice Elena Kagan, writing for the majority, noted, "Dr. Richardson's comprehensive research demonstrates that patterns of judicial bias constitute a form of institutional discrimination that is intolerable in a system committed to equal justice under equal law." In one of Northwestern's constitutional law classes, a student raised his hand with a question that brought Dr. Richardson's journey full circle. "Professor Richardson," asked the student, "when you walked into that courtroom 3 years ago, did you know that Judge Patterson's prejudice would lead to all these reforms?" And there we saw how justice triumphed over prejudice in the most powerful way. Dr. Amelia Richardson, with a single phone call from the courthouse steps, did more than defend her own rights. She transformed the entire federal judicial system and created lasting change that would protect civil rights for future generations. This story shows us that individual courage can truly change systems, but it requires more than just standing up in the moment. It requires using the platform, expertise, and connections you have to create accountability and reform. Dr. Richardson could have accepted Judge Patterson's rejection and quietly walked away. Instead, he chose to fight, not just for his brother's memory, but for every person who would face discrimination in the courtroom after him. This lesson is not just about recognizing bias. It's about understanding that those with privilege, expertise, and platforms have a responsibility to use them for justice. When we see discrimination, we cannot be passive observers. We must be active advocates for change. The reforms inspired by Dr. Richardson's courage, Bias training, statistical monitoring, accountability measures made the justice system fairer and more equitable. But most importantly, they showed that even the most powerful institutions can be changed when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice. His brother Marcus did not die in vain. His memory lives on in every fair trial, every unbiased decision, and every civil rights case that seeks justice. And Dr. Richardson's courage reminds us that the most important victories sometimes come not from winning individual cases, but from changing the system. If this story has moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories about the power of standing up for courage, justice, and what is right. Turn on notifications to never miss an update and share your own experiences with prejudice or discrimination in the comments below. Remember, justice isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we create through our actions, our courage, and our refusal to accept inequality. When we see injustice, we all have a responsibility to speak up, stand up, and fight for what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video where we'll discover another incredible story of how one person's courage can change the world. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never forget that your voice matters in the fight for justice.
Catherine's leadership demonstrated that true healthcare reform can be achieved not only through policy changes and administrative directives, but also through personal commitment to ensuring that every patient receives the dignity, respect, and appropriate medical care that should be the hallmark of the healing profession. Years later, when medical schools studied the transformation of the Chicago General Medical Network, they would point to that night in Emergency Room 7 as a turning point, not because of the conflict it created, but because it reminded everyone that access to excellent medical care should be available to all, regardless of who they are or how they appear to those tasked with healing them. The story of what happened in that Chicago emergency room powerfully reminded us that the greatest strength of healthcare lies not in its technology or facilities, but in the commitment to treat every person entrusted to their care with the compassion, respect, and clinical excellence they deserve, as those who have sworn an oath to do no harm. If you like the story, don't forget to like it, subscribe, and comment. Your support is very valuable to me. Thank you. See you in new stories.